the number one thing for me is to hire well. It's really hard to overstate how important it is to find the right team members, and how costly it can be when you get it wrong.
Welcome back to the CleanTechies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Eileen Waris from Energize Capital, which until the date of this recording had been known as Energize Ventures. We spoke with Eileen on the day they changed their name and announced the $300 million close of their second growth fund. In this episode, we cover Eileen's career story, what they're doing at Energize, why they focus on software, where their thesis came from, her thoughts on the state of climate tech funding, her advice to climate tech founders, and a few other topics. So without any further delay, enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the show, Eileen. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I am fine as frog here. I can't complain. I mean, it is a little bit warm in New York at the moment, but listen, it's better, I guess, better warm than sleeting or something outside, you know?
Yeah, well, I am in San Francisco today, and I always forget that even if it's super hot everywhere else in the country, especially during summertime, that it's like still 50 degrees here. So I was ill-suited for this trip.
That's actually really, I always forget about that. People have said, oh, you need to always wear a sweater in Silicon Valley. And I never think about that. I've never been there, so I don't remember because I've never been. But everybody says that, right? They're always like, oh, it's so like chilly here. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's in California. Shouldn't it be warm, you know?
Yeah, they say the coldest winter I ever spent was the summer in San Francisco.
Certainly, that's quite interesting. Well, it's good to have you on the show. Really excited to chat to you today. I guess let's just start off by just give us a quick introduction to who you are and kind of what you're doing today.
Yeah, great to be here. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Eileen Waris. I am a principal on the ventures team at Energize Capital. And I focus on making investments and helping to build companies in the climate software space.
Very nice. And tell us a little bit, how did you get into climate in particular? What led you here?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been passionate about trying to find solutions for climate change, or at least passionate about sustainability. Actually, it was my high school Spanish teacher that kind of got me into it for the first time. Her name is Senora Nolt. Senora Nolt, if you're out there, I'm giving you a shout out. She started this club that I was a part of called SAVE, which is an acronym that stood for Students Against Violating the Earth. And I was the president, and I implemented the first composting program in my high school. I have no idea if that's still in place. That was a long time ago, but I guess I would say that was kind of my start. I started my career in management consulting, and my focus in management consulting was on M&A, advising on both the buy side and the sell side, pre and post merger integrations. And while not immediately like relevant to climate, I would say it definitely was relevant for venture. We've seen a lot of consolidation happening in many of our portfolio companies as they get to the later stages, have also considered their own acquisitions. And so it's been really helpful. But there was one project that I spent a long time working on that was kind of pivotal in terms of changing the way that I thought about my career and what role I could play in climate change. While I was there, I worked on one of the largest pharma chemical companies in the world, was acquiring the largest pesticide and GMO producer in the world. And as someone who at the time really cared deeply about sustainability, I had a lot of internal conflict when I got staffed on the project. And I think in part that was due to a lot of preconceived notions that I had around what it meant, those words, GMO, pesticides, chemicals, all these things that I thought were kind of inherently evil. And I realized that it was just a lot more complicated than I was making it out to be. And I learned so much through that experience about the trade-offs of sustainable food systems. How do we grow enough food to feed a growing population in an environment where weather patterns are changing and our resources are increasingly constrained? And all of those different trade-offs and that really complicated equation just got me thinking, like, I feel like there could be something I could be doing here. Instead of just being personally passionate, like being a vegetarian, this is not enough. I need to figure out a way that I could dedicate my career to solving some of these challenges. And it was around the same time that I was applying to business school. And Stanford had a program where you could get your MBA and then your master's in environmental sciences. At the time, that was called YIPER. Today, it's getting rolled up under the Dorr School of Sustainability, which I also think is, if people aren't familiar, the famous venture capitalist John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins recently gifted $1 billion to the university to start the School of Sustainability. And I think it's a really cool reflection that, like, 10, 20 years ago, the cool thing to do at Stanford was to get your CS degree, and now it's to go into sustainability. So I love that. But anyway, I spent 3 years there in the program that kind of ended up turning into that. And I test drove a bunch of different options. I worked in corporate sustainability. I helped out a couple different startups. I did a ton of academic research. But ultimately, it was the time that I spent in venture capital that I really loved the most. I loved the day-to-day opportunity to work with entrepreneurs and learn about all of the different solutions that they were making. I also kind of at the time was feeling like I was more of a jack of all trades. I couldn't pick just one problem that I wanted to focus on. And I think with venture, it's really exciting to be able to index across a bunch of different megatrends. And one day you're talking to an entrepreneur in the energy space, the next day it's electric vehicles, the next day it's carbon markets. And I just thought that was really exciting to be able to have exposure to all of those things. And so fell in love with venture capital. And that's kind of what brought me to Energize.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel. Very nice. So I like a couple of things you said there that are interesting. I want to maybe just go back on, which is the one thing you talked about where you had the kind of how you say personal like inner conflict of that project, but you then realize, hey, there's certain trade-offs that have to be made, right? Like the reason why I'm also somebody who I would classify in the same bucket, right? I'm not a big fan. I come from parents who were farmers, right? So I have mixed feelings about those big agriculture companies. But the point being, a lot of people need to be fed, right? And we can't just because it may not be the most sustainable method of doing it. It's also what feeds people, right? Something that has to be done, right? So I think that it's interesting to consider those challenges and have the kind of realistic perspective. And this is something that a lot of people debate right now, right? What can we really become sustainable at and immediately, and what things do we have to find a way to like transition out of them, right? And I do find those problems to be really challenging and fascinating. So would be maybe interested to hear your thoughts about that a little bit more later on. But one thing I do want to ask about is, and you alluded to this essentially, but how did you, so you, when you started out your career, you didn't have this goal to get into VC particularly, right? It came along the way through that experience with business school.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I just think it's really interesting. Maybe be keen to hear your thoughts candidly right now about, being in VC now. A lot of people, especially a lot of people I know, young people, they're like, oh man, like VC is exactly where you want to go. You should work towards it. And for a long time, I thought that I would want that myself. But over time, I realized I don't know if I necessarily want to be somebody who manages money. I'd rather be building companies. So I'm kind of curious to hear your kind of candid thoughts about what it's like to be a VC now, and how do you think about that now?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think if I had one specific idea that I thought I was the best person to execute on and make an impact on climate change, there's probably no more fulfilling career path than that. And so for anyone that has the entrepreneurial itch and wants to go out and build something themselves and feels like they know what that looks like, then I think that you should absolutely pursue that path. And I think even today, I mean, I love my job right now. If I felt like there was one thing that I could be the best person in the world at to solve in terms of climate change, then I would absolutely go after it. But for now, what I love about my job is that it marries two of the things that I love the most. One, just the mission of trying to extend the life of this planet, and two, building relationships. That's pretty much what I spent most of my time on day to day. And for me, that's really enjoyable. And whether that's bouncing ideas off of my team members during investment team meetings, or reaching out to entrepreneurs that I think have really compelling ideas, or helping a portfolio company overcome an existing challenge. All of that stuff, all of that work is very relationship based. And for me, it's just really rewarding to have those two things come together.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, no, that's interesting to hear. One thing I'm also curious about is how did you end up landing the role with Energize? Because I'm curious, like, was it specifically the schooling experience that really was like, hey, this is great. They really wanted to chat with you. Like, how did that process look?
Yeah, so this is a piece of advice actually that I would give anybody that was looking to get into venture capital. I was specifically trying to get into venture capital at a firm that was focused on climate solutions. And I had done a ton of work while I was in school on carbon markets. And this was like 4 years ago, before carbon markets was really like a big thing. But I had done a ton of my own work on it. I had a little bit of a nuanced take on what kinds of solutions that I thought could be helpful. I had tracked a few early stage companies that were emerging that I had heard of through my network, through the Stanford ecosystem, and just kind of climate more broadly. And I had come up with sort of this mini thesis. And when I first started having conversations with Energize, it turned out that they were also beginning to start an investment thesis in that space. And so it was this really natural thing for us to just engage over and have really productive discussions. And it was fun to kind of jam on ideas together. And then ultimately that led to me joining the team. And then once I got there, I helped, along with many other people on the investment team that contributed to this, helped do a lot of our analysis that eventually turned into one of our core pillars, which is carbon platforms. So we've now made 3 investments in that space, and it was really organic. Came from interest on their side and interest on my side, and it was just a really good fit. So I guess to summarize it, advice I would give to people looking to get into venture: the relationship building piece is important, the networking piece is important. I think people index on those a lot when they're looking for a job in venture, but also just like follow your own curiosity, do a bunch of research in a space that you think is interesting, pull together your own ideas, and then share those, and those will naturally create opportunities for you.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, I think it's interesting if you can think critically about something and come up with a new idea, it's helpful in some ways if you're new, because you don't have preconceived notions of how things are. Or you may be missing, the details that other people are already aware of. And by putting it out there in the world, you essentially are finding, like, it's so random how people say, they usually say you put it out in the world and it'll find you, right? The right people will find you. And it sounds really silly, but it actually does work, because it doesn't take more than one person to be like, hey, this seems interesting. I have a friend working on this or whatnot. Or when you are pursuing that job opportunity, you then can demonstrate, listen, this is not something I decided to cook up last night. I didn't suddenly become interested in your company just because it's a job, right? Like, I'm interested in this because of this opportunity. And here's the social proof and the timestamps that demonstrate I've been, writing blog posts or doing projects on it, right? Things like that. So I think that's really fascinating. I'm a big fan of that, of that line of thought, right? Let's talk about Energize in particular. So let's kind of break down for us exactly a little bit of the history of Energize Capital now, and how they got started and kind of what they are now today and what they focus on.
Yeah. So you caught us on an exciting day, because today is the day that we've actually transitioned from being Energize Ventures to being Energize Capital. And we are an investment firm. We're based in Chicago, and we're focused on becoming the leading investor in climate software. And we got our start back in 2016. And this was kind of like the valley of death for climate tech. It was a few years post CleanTech bust. A lot of the firms that had kind of entered the space and had been scared away by all of the terrible returns that had been happening. And so there weren't a lot of investors in the space. And we saw an opportunity. We saw that, a lot of the investments that had been made in the hardware space were beginning to pay off. Solar and wind were coming down the cost curve. There was buy for a lot of these solutions, and there was a lack of capital providers in the space to serve the entrepreneurs that were innovating. And so we said, why not us? I think one of our goals when we started the firm was to learn from the mistakes that had been made before. And if you look at some of the companies that were successful from the first climate tech or clean tech, as they were calling it then, boom, a lot of them had a heavy digital or software component to their business model. And so we kind of took that learning and said, what if we created a firm that was focused on partnering with entrepreneurs that were building digital solutions for this space? And that's really how Energize was born.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I do. Okay, that's helpful. I love the fact you guys actually look at the mistakes last companies made, because it's so ridiculous to think that there's actually a relatively good data set. I mean, it's not huge compared to what it is now, but there's a pretty good data set on some of the things not to do, but yet still a lot of climate VCs or VCs that are now branding themselves or changing into climate supposedly are just completely like overlooking all of that insight from the past. Um, so let's talk about this then. I think that's pretty clear what the areas you focus on. The stage that you work in. So maybe if I understand correctly, it's now across various stages. Can you talk about that? What types of entrepreneurs and where in their journey should they reach out to kind of be part of the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the exciting things now is we're serving entrepreneurs across a much broader swath of the journey. So we started with our core fund, which served entrepreneurs in Series A through C. And we've now executed a growth strategy. And so that pretty much just picks up right where our ventures fund leaves off, Series C through IPO, or whatever exit comes next for you. And then maybe just to dig a little bit deeper on the areas that we focus on, it's the same across both funds. So at a high level, it's climate software. But if it's helpful, I can kind of drill down into maybe some of the specifics.
Yeah, I would be curious to understand maybe the different verticals you focus on. And you already mentioned kind of why you focus on software, but I would be curious to also dig a little deeper. Why not consider some of at least the light hardware spaces, because there's a lot of things that need to be decarbonized in that space as well. So would be curious to also ask that question.
Yeah, I can cover both of those. Maybe first, I'll kind of cover the spaces that we invest in, and then that'll provide a little bit more clarity into, what are the software solutions that we're looking at, or why the focus on software. So I guess when we think about where software has, the biggest opportunity, we believe that roughly 60 to 80% of emissions are going to come from two things: getting more renewables and clean power deployed, and then electrification of carbon-intensive industries and equipment. On the renewable side, that means like how can we design, deploy, and optimize the performance of more solar, wind, and clean firm power. And then on the electrification side, we're really talking about the electrification of industries and equipments so that we can help maximize the benefit of all of that clean power that's being onloaded to the grid. And so this includes things like electric vehicles, home electrification, things like heat pumps and smart energy systems, commercial building electrification, energy storage, and then also on the demand side, how do we optimize our consumption patterns so that we're consuming the most energy when wind and solar and clean power is at an all-time high, and then when those intermittent power sources are producing less energy, we're curtailing and consuming less energy. So that covers a decent chunk of emission reduction, but then we recognize, there are going to be areas that we can't electrify away. And so in that case, kind of going back to the initial investment thesis I was talking to you about, we invest in what we call carbon platforms. And what that really means is that, there are solutions out there that make it easier to determine first, what are your emissions and what are the biggest sources of those emissions? And then how do you model it out? What are the costs for that and the time? There's a really interesting company in our portfolio called Cyanide Technologies, and they're a decarbonization software platform. And they do a really good job at this. They go beyond just the basic carbon accounting, and they do something that very few, if any, other software platforms that I've seen out there can do, which is they can create a marginal abatement cost curve. That means they can tell you what the marginal cost to abate each emission is, so you can focus on maximizing the ROI of your decarbonization dollars. So go after those lowest cost projects first, and maximize your decarbonization potential. Finally, sort of the last area that we invest in, I think acknowledging that unfortunately some damage has already been done, and that, you know, certain effects of climate change have already been locked in, as we're seeing now with each day this summer, like a new record-breaking heat streak. You know, we're looking for digital solutions that can help us to adapt and be more resilient to the extreme weather and the climate change that we know that we're going to have to face. And so this might look at solutions that are better at identifying and preventing wildfire risk, or helping our grid be more resilient to extreme weather, or helping frontline workers and families make plans for extreme weather and climate disasters. So we're also interested in solutions like that. And then
Very nice. I just to interject real quickly. It's a pretty good, I think covers a lot of the major things, and it's really interesting to hear. I'd be curious. I'll have to look afterwards through all the portfolio companies. It sounds like there's a lot of really fascinating ones in there. But let's move on to the topic of why just software, right? Why not a little bit of hardware at least?
Yeah. So I think first it's important to acknowledge that, like, it is impossible to solve the climate crisis without innovation in hardware. And many of the solutions that we invest in touch hardware in some way. Many of them are layered over solar panels, wind turbines, transmission lines. And so it's not that we're totally avoiding touching hardware, but it is our belief that there are now other forms of capital that are better suited for deep tech innovation at the early stages. And actually, in some cases, traditional venture capital is not the right choice for innovation there. You have project finance, you have non-dilutive funding and grant money, or like in some quick cases, there have been new funds that are creative, longer dated funds that keep, you know, scientists and PhDs on staff, and those are really well suited. I think Breakthrough Energy Ventures is a great example. Those funds are well suited for those early stage hardware and deep tech plays. But for us, the best case scenario is for us to invest in solutions that have the potential to accelerate technologies that have been already proven out today, that are commercially available and economically viable, but have some sort of problem or bottleneck that can be addressed with software.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good to hear. I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a question that I'm trying to kind of trap you in some ways, but the point being that you recognized what a venture capital firm, what a VC firm specifically is good at. And I think that the issue that I'm noticing with a lot of the VCs that enter, they're willing to go headlong into hardware and they expect the returns to be like software, right? And especially software in a space that, you know, like traditional tech world where things are relatively built out, there's a good ecosystem. But even if you're just doing a software company in, you know, a legacy industry or something, you're still going to see more difficulty, right, in achieving that timeline, because it's just there's no ecosystem built out. It's a little different. So I do appreciate that, the honesty and people recognizing where they can do well. One thing I'm curious about is, given that hardware is so difficult to to innovate in, it takes a lot longer. Are you partnering with companies that are more on that research side, where you can take your insights from what you learn in the software space to then feed them in to those companies to help them accelerate what they're doing a little better?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually a core part of our strategy. If you look at our limited partner base, about a third of our capital comes from corporate strategics. So we have a number of companies that are leaders in the hardware, energy, and heavy industry space that we talk to on a weekly basis, to learn about what are the biggest challenges that they're facing. Where can software help move the needle in terms of, you know, helping to deploy more renewables, helping to optimize the performance of the assets that they have, helping to decarbonize. Just to name a few, we've got Invenergy, which is the largest private developer of renewable energy projects, was our first LP, and the founder and CEO, as well as the CFO of that company, sit on our investment committee. We've got Schneider Electric, General Electric, Caterpillar, a handful of utilities that, while they don't necessarily have build their own hardware, they interact with it on a daily basis. And so a lot of our most proprietary insights come from those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very nice. No, that's good to hear. I just think it's interesting to see how people are collaborating, because obviously information is key and a lot of people don't want to share it. So it's interesting to see how we can help, because this is more of a collective, right? The whole world has to kind of work together if we're going to solve this problem.
Right.
What would you say are so just to clarify one thing for me, do you typically invest at an early stage as well, or do you start around Series A?
We started Series A. That's the
Series A.
earliest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So from Series A, when you're looking at the first time to write a check into a company, um, what would you say are the traits or the typical characteristics that you look for in a company off the top, like the really big ones, to help you identify, hey, this is something that we think has legs for us to
Yeah.
invest in?
Yeah. So I'd say first and foremost, we're focused on team. Like, is this the right team to solve this problem? Do we have a great working relationship with the founder? Usually we've known the founder for several years before we invest in a company. I think the second thing that we look at is, more so than over focusing on the product or the technology that they have, because we know that there will be many iterations of that, and this is just version one, especially at the Series A stage. We try to focus on the problem that they're solving. Is this a real mission critical problem? Are the budgets growing? Is it serving a market that is growing? And so I think we really try to zero in on that and answer some of those questions. And if we like those answers, then that's typically enough to pique our interest at that stage.
Okay. And then along with that, I'll get to this a little bit, but we saw that there was an uptick in early stage funding in the first half, but less late stage. I'm just kind of curious if you in some ways collaborate with the early stage VCs, like the seed stage, to help them understand, hey, with your portfolio companies, they need to orient themselves towards this objective, because that will help us to know that, hey, we can make this investment and we can continue from there. Is there collaboration there between those funds? Because there's obviously a lot of new entrants. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, no, and we make great efforts to be highly collaborative and build relationships at the early stages, both individually with entrepreneurs. Like, it is never too early if you're an entrepreneur to reach out to Energize. Even if you're just in the days of ideation, we're happy to bounce ideas and make introductions if we can be helpful. But we also have more formal partnerships. So I'm on the investment committee of a firm called Evergreen Climate Innovations, and they are a nonprofit venture capital firm based in the Midwest, and they make early stage investments in early stage companies that are helping to fight climate change. We're also investment partners of an organization called Third Derivative, and that's Rocky Mountain Institute's Climate Accelerator. And then we have relationships with a number of pre-seed and seed stage funds across the ecosystem that we nurture and then co-invest with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And along the same lines with the collaboration topic, are there, it might be slightly different if it's just software, but are there ways that you're trying to help your portfolio companies navigate between some of the government issues, like policy things, and just kind of bringing all the science, the policy, and the technical commercial things all together? Is there a way that you're trying to offer some in-house services? Because a startup, even if they got Series A, they're probably not going to have time to hire or have the money to hire a policy analyst to just sit there and read what's going on in the policy, or lobby DC, for example. Is there anything you're doing on that front?
Yeah, so Katie McLean, one of our managing partners and COO, has had a long career both between the public and private sector, and so she's held various roles in the public sector. Also worked for the Clinton Foundation, and has many deep ties in that space. And so she's been really helpful in helping some of our portfolio companies that either have challenges or opportunities in this space navigate that world.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of people who seem to think that VC's job is not to really get involved at all and help, but it's a matter of resources, right? And if you can have people who've been in their careers longer, in a lot of cases, right? You obviously some founders have been in their careers a while, but a lot of them are more junior. They don't have the connections, right? Not necessarily. So that's interesting to hear. I appreciate that. So let's move on a little bit to more of this topic on the funding report. So I'm kind of curious to hear, I guess, just to set the stage for people, the ClimateTech VC H1 funding report for 2023 came out, and the broad strokes, there's a lot of different things that were mentioned in there, but the thing that I picked up on that I thought was interesting was, or at least the most that stood out the most, was that late stage funding substantially dropped year over year, and there was more seed stage rounds that were more seed stage money that went in to the space. So I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts on why that is and where you see things going in the second half. Just want to make sure that people, do they have an optimistic or a negative, pessimistic look on the future of how companies are going to come through that product market fit stage and get to Series A.
Yeah. So a couple things to unpack there. Maybe I'll just start with just blanket reaction to the report. First of all, I love CTVC and all the work that they put out. It's really high quality stuff. Typically, when we're reacting or interpreting market signals, we try not to be too overly prescriptive in one direction or another, especially when you're looking at a relatively short period of time. I think when other investors in the climate space were out there saying, "Oh, we're untouchable and we're totally protected from all of the downturn that's happening across the broader market and technology space," we knew that that was not totally true. And while I do think the climate space is resilient and that we're insulated from some of these forces due to long-term, enduring, generational tailwinds that are bolstering up the climate revolution, and we can get into all those in a second. But despite those tailwinds, I think at the end of the day, if you look at it, an economic downturn that's impacting every corner of the economy, we would have been foolish to think that it wasn't going to affect the space that we operate in and affect our customers. And so I think because the downturn was slower to hit the climate sector, we had more time to prepare and react. And so I think both on the investor side and on the entrepreneurial side, steps were taken to kind of mitigate that. I think on the later stage entrepreneurial side, a lot of founders decided to reduce burn, extend their runway. Maybe they lowered their revenue targets a little bit and just got a little less aggressive with what their plans were, and that enabled them to delay getting out into market. Another thing that we've also been seeing at the later stages is that many entrepreneurs are going out with actually a lot of runway left to maintain optionality. So rather than seeing entrepreneurs raising with 4 to 6 months of runway, we're seeing entrepreneurs that have 8 to 18 months of runway. And they're getting out there, they're testing the waters, they're figuring out if they can raise. And, if you raised in 2021 at this crazy high multiple, then it can be a really big challenge to grow into that valuation. So you want to figure out if you can raise again at an up round or at least at a flat round. And if not, you're going to wait it out. I think there are also dynamics at play on the investor side of things. I think we've talked about the denominator effect a lot in the news recently. But as public market valuations came down before private market valuations came down, the proportion of those two things was kind of skewed for limited partners. And so they didn't have the availability to make more private investments. And so a lot of investors were forced to think about extending the lifetime of their funds. And they were in less of a rush to deploy capital. And so I think there was less urgency on both sides, especially as you got closer to, that late stage private market getting close to the public market. I think at the seed stage, it's easy to say, you have a lot of time to wait out those effects. And so it's natural to be more active. I also think the seed stage has benefited from talent shifts that have been happening in the technology market more broadly. We're seeing so many entrepreneurs that weren't necessarily in climate before, but maybe we're doing something else in technology, moving out of that as shifts were happening and trying to start things in the climate space. And so there's been a lot of early stage activity for a number of reasons. I'd say the other thing to just keep in mind as we interpret these trends, if you're comparing year over year, like H1 of 2022, even though the rest of the venture market had slowed down, it was still a pretty active time in the climate space. And so when you compare it year over year, you're comparing it to still one of the hottest periods that we've ever had in terms of deal flow. So the downturn may not be, as bad as it looks.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing I was just wondering is like, are the companies that got funding in the seed stage last year not getting to the point where they can, actually raise Series A? So that'd be my next question is, are you actually, in terms of maybe like total deal flow, maybe you could comment on that, like from last year to this year, are you actually seeing as many companies that are, meet the basic criteria to qualify for that round? Is that something you're seeing more of, or, the same as last year roughly?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixed bag of things. I mean, in terms of quality, what I will say is that if you are a high quality company in this space, you will be able to attract capital. And we actually have a body of work that I can kind of point to for this. We've gotten in the annual habit of publishing our electrification of everything work. And so that's a composition of a lot of our analysis and investment theses related to electrification. And within that body of work, we talk about a subset of companies that we are calling our top 30 innovators in the electrification, software innovators in the electrification space. And it's a group of early stage companies. And if you look at the performance of the 2022 cohort over the last 12 months, and we're talking about in an environment where the best public SaaS companies in the world were trading at 25 to 50% plus below where they were trading at a year before. This cohort of 30 early stage private companies had a median enterprise valuation step up of 2.4. Cumulatively, they raised $1.8 billion. And if you had invested in that cohort, today you would have a 2x money on invested capital. Not a single one of them went out of business. And I also think there were 5 or 6 M&A activities amongst that group. So I think if you look at what we deem to be a very high quality subset of that market, it goes to show that if you are a high performer, you will be able to continue to attract capital, you will be able to continue to attract customers, and there will continue to be exits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's helpful to understand. You mentioned something also, which was the people shifting from markets. We saw a lot of layoffs at the beginning of the year. I think that it was obviously very difficult for many people, but there was a certain silver lining that, being in the talent space, we noticed it, that companies were able to fill, especially software companies, were able to fill their job requisitions very easily in the climate space because there's a lot of people who want to work in climate, right? And this was simply their excuse to go, take that slight pay cut to go work in climate instead of, continuing to work at Meta. So I think that there's a couple interesting things that happened there. It certainly has been, I would say it's probably been very good for the climate space from a talent perspective, based on what I could see. Also help them save money from recruiters.
Yeah.
Certainly. So let me see. What else do I want to go over here? I think one thing I guess we can move on to some of the advice pieces here.
Actually, if you had one thing I was going to comment on, you had sent me and I had just seen you release today your and Samil's discussion on that CTVC H1 report. And you had a quote in there that I actually really liked, and I wrote it down. You said, when talking about scaling solutions at the early stages, with software, the problems are known, and it's about execution to scale. And I thought that actually really eloquently sums up a lot about what we think about this market, especially at the growth stages. I think one really good example from the Energize portfolio is our most recently announced investment that we did at our growth fund in a Lithuania-based company called PVCase. In getting to know the utility scale solar space through a lot of the partnerships that I've already mentioned, one of the things that we noticed is there was a need for better tools to reduce bottlenecks in the design and deployment phases of utility scale solar development. And we did our research and we found that there was really like one undisputed leader, and that was PVCase, and their software was really good at helping unclog those bottlenecks. And this is a capital efficient business that was growing quickly in a market that was also growing really quickly. And they had recognized a need upstream, that there was a bottleneck in the site selection process for utility scale solar development. And they had identified a target that they wanted to acquire. And they needed a partner to help them do that. And so at that point, Energize, and we partnered with Highland Capital on this deal as well, helped to finance that round so that they could acquire that company. And it's been off to the races ever since then. But to bring it back to your quote, I think, with software, the problems oftentimes are known, and it's really just about executing and finding the right partner to execute that strategy.
Yeah, I think the partnerships is really big, right? This is something that's come up with couple shows ago, where the issue was not the technology per se, it was who they were selling to, right? They were trying to sell to a brand, and the brand was all in for it, right? But the brand didn't have the authority to change the technology, right? They were selling some kind of a supplemental thing for plastics, right? And you can't just tell the brand, hey, we're going to use this. They're gonna be all over it, right? But as soon as the manufacturer finds out, they're like, I'm not putting, experimental liquids in my, very expensive machinery. So you have to understand the right execution. You need to have the right people, because these are, in a lot of cases, at least when it comes to hardware, legacy industries, even on the software space too, right? You're trying to get a legacy industry to do something differently. You might have to understand how their space works, right? And some of these, unfortunately, it's just kind of a good old boys network, and you got to know the right people. Still, obviously, hopefully that changes, but that's how a lot of these industries operate still. So I think it's interesting. Appreciate you having to listen to it and bringing up that.
Yeah.
Let's see. I want to go to. I think let's just start a little bit broadly for advice to other founders and VCs. Um, we obviously have a lot of people. We've talked about this. The whole world essentially has to operate in kind of, to some extent, in collaboration to solve the climate crisis. So, what would you say is your advice to other VCs or founders, depending on what you're interested in talking about, on how to make good decisions on what companies to build, or as they're building their companies, or for VCs, what investments to make and how to make really good decisions so that the money is not being spent in a place that's really, really silly.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with advice to founders, specifically when it comes to building companies. I think this piece of advice is something that will resonate with you and your work at Next Wave. But the number one thing for me is to hire well. It's really hard to overstate how important it is to find the right team members, and how costly it can be when you get it wrong. And this is a mistake that is inevitable. You're not gonna make the right hire every single time, but it's really important to find the right partners, especially if you're super early in your stage and you're looking for that co-founder. There's a saying, and it's a little bit cheesy, but it's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think anybody that's joining this movement is in it for the long haul. Finding the right person to be on that journey with you is so important. The second piece of advice that I would give to founders is to stay focused. I think a common mistake that we see with founders is losing focus on what is the core problem that they're trying to help solve. I think this can get especially muddled in the software space, because oftentimes you're building these digital solutions, and as you're doing this, you're finding all these new applications and use cases for what you're building. It can be tempting to go after every shiny object that you see. But when we see entrepreneurs lose focus on what their core problem is, they lose touch with their customers, and it can be a really easy way to throw a lot of money away. And so, especially at the early stages, maintaining that focus, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's helpful. So when you say maintain the focus, how do you help them define what their focus is? Is it just basically, hey, what problem are we solving, and stay focused on that, and then they'll figure out the solution to it, or what's the advice there?
Yeah, I would say, be able to define the core problem that you're solving in one sentence. Know
Yeah.
where the budget to solve that problem is coming from. Know who controls that budget, and also know, at the end of the day, who's going to be in charge of using that solution or implementing that solution throughout the organization.
The one sentence thing is so powerful. So many people have no idea how to define it, but it needs to be TLDR. Everything needs to be brought down to the very granular, because this is the whole reason I originally started the podcast. Was I was like, I grew up in a place where nobody, I'm from Wisconsin originally, and nobody that I grew up around believed that climate change was real. And they're like, oh, why would you invest? Like, why would we have solar and wind? It's going to like, it's bad for the economy. And I was like, okay, I guess whatever. Like, I didn't know anything any different until I started talking to climate founders when I started working in renewables. And I started talking to some of the founders like, well, you're telling me that the technology is cheaper, a better product, and better for the environment. And you can also like, and I could easily summarize these things. And I was an outsider, right? I could summarize them in one sentence, and it just made total sense. But the issue is that a lot of people don't understand the big words, right? They don't understand all of these like fancy terminology, and it needs to be very concise.
Yeah, keep it simple. Solving climate change is difficult enough. Keep everything else as simple as possible.
Yeah. On the talent topic, I appreciate you bringing that up. I'm curious to understand, you mentioned in particular, it's super important to have the right team early on. We've done a bit of work with really early stage companies that it's extremely difficult because we have to work on on the promise that we're going to get paid at the end of the day, right? Because they usually are, they're raising money at the moment in order to pay this co-founder or whatnot. Um, have you seen any ways that companies kind of make big mistakes, or how do you help them to make sure they have the right team in place at the beginning, even when they don't necessarily have uh, they don't perceive that they have the money in the bank to afford paying a recruiter. They're just trying to go off their network, but maybe their network is small and they just go with whoever they find. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think sometimes the mistakes happen when the entrepreneur waits until it's a hair on fire problem to think about that position. And then they are tired, they're in a rush to get it off their plate, and they want to hire the first person that meets like the minimum bar. And I think that's a really easy recipe for hiring the wrong person. I'd say not having a very clear idea for what you're looking for, not having kind of your hiring scorecard in place and knowing what are the must-haves and what are the nice to haves is another mistake. And then, for the key senior hires, like we absolutely say it's worth making the investment. And if that means you have to partner with a recruiter because that person doesn't exist in your network, finding the right person is worth the investment.
Yeah, I think it's hard to convince people that when they're really, really tight in the budget, right? But if you think about it, it's also a lot of new founders, right? That's one thing I've noticed with at least the hardware side. You've got a lot of like really, really sharp PhDs, and they're used to just meeting somebody through their network. But sometimes it takes a little bit extra effort to find them. And sometimes in the hardware space, this may not apply to software as much, maybe on the sales side, but on the hardware space, you oftentimes you want somebody from the conventional industry that you're trying to change, and those people don't necessarily advertise broadly, that they're looking for a climate opportunity, right? It takes a lot of sorting and finding the needle in the haystack. Um, okay, let's go to. Did you have any particular advice for the VCs then as well?
Um, no, maybe just for the people looking to get into VC. I think I already gave my two pieces of advice, but I think it's one, focus on building relationships, not just with VCs because you're trying to get a job there, but with entrepreneurs. I think you'll learn a lot more through those interactions. And then two is just like start doing the work before you get the job. Think about what are the areas you want to invest in. Come up with a nuanced take on a different area. I think that will make you better at the job, and it will also make you a more attractive candidate.
Mm-hmm. What about when it comes to getting pitched? Obviously, you probably see pitch decks every single day. What are some of the like key piece of advice you'd offer to founders on what to include in there? Because I think that in some cases, I've heard a mixed bag is being presented to them. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts there on the pitch deck itself.
And I think it goes back to what we said earlier, is just keep it simple. Be clear and crisp. Make sure that you're getting to the point quickly. If investors can't answer the question, what does this company do, after reading the first slide, you probably waited too long to get your core message out there. And so I think it's just be really, really crisp and concise and focused when you're communicating your message.
100%. I think it's very difficult sometimes for people to do that because sometimes you're so wrapped up in things, and it's this way with many things, not just pitching, right? It's so many things. It's easy to get wrapped up in your own ideas of how things are. But no, this has been really great. Is there any other kind of final things that you want to close us off with? Where people should reach you? Any calls to action for people?
No, I mean, I know we talked a lot about the slowdown, but I will say like Energize Capital is still investing. We're still looking for entrepreneurs to partner with. So if you're building something exciting in the climate software space, reach out to us. My email is Eileen@EnergizeCap.com. And it's actually ewaris@EnergizeCap.com. Now I'm remembering we changed our emails this morning. But yeah, reach out and get in touch.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you. And I'm really excited to see the investments that you guys pump out this in the coming year.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.